Alright, so this video is just meant to help you along with our cylinder projects. You should have already at least done the first wheel exercise, first day on the wheel, and basically have adhering the clay to the wheel without having it slip off, sealing it to the wheel, and then pushing it around and just having your hands just at least a little used to working with the clay already. So now we're just going to move on into the steps of actually throwing a cylinder. So we're going to pat our clay and we're going to seal it. All right, it's always the first things that we're going to do. And remember our wheel speed, we don't want full speed depending on your wheel. So my wheel actually goes pretty quick. You can just hear it. That's pretty fast. So I'm going to back that down to about halfway up to about 3/4. And that's a good starting speed. And what you can actually do is just let your foot off the pedal and let your wheel spin. So hands really wet in water. And the way I teach this is going to be our left hand, if you're right-handed, is going to be our workhorse hand. Our right hand is going to be a supplemental hand. So with our left hand, get our elbow into our body. You're going to scoot your seat as close to the wheel as you can actually get it, so that when you're actually leaning forward, your arm is moving past the center line. You don't want to be hunching your back. Right? So straight back and bend at the hips. With your left hand, what we do want to make sure so we don't hurt our wrist is that if you draw a line up your forearm, your thumb should be in line with your forearm. You shouldn't have a bent wrist at all. That's going to be a telltale sign that you're going to be hurting and damaging your wrist. So you don't want any of the pressure coming from your fingers or this knuckle area of your hand. You want it to be coming from the very base, that heel part of your palm. And keeping your thumb in line is really going to help you do that. So straight down, so a vertical palm. If we go back to our centering video, a vertical palm makes the clay go up, and all you have to do is push forward. And then a slanted palm, so I think of shaking someone's hand. It's like that same gesture. Your hand's going to do that same tilt forward. The pressure is all the same. It's just the shape of your hand is changing the shape of the clay. So again, we should have this step down by now. But vertical palm, clay goes up. Slanted palm, clay goes down. You shouldn't have to actually put any pressure from the top down. And what we're doing is really trying to control our clay. We're not trying to force it into the middle, we're trying to guide it towards the center. And then your right hand can just be a supplemental hand to help keep where the clay connects to the wheel head. You can actually use your fingers down here to help keep that tucked in. Alright, so a few more times. Straight. Just pushing forward is all I'm doing. Clay goes up because the shape of my hand is making the clay go up. Hands tilted forward. Same amount of pressure. Use your right hand again. Seal that. Just a couple more times. That's all from the vertical palm. So you can see my right hand is actually supporting the back side of my thumb here. You can use your whole right hand back here to support that thumb, or you can actually use two hands to center. But for right now, as we're just learning, we're just going to learn how to control our left hand, and then as we move on, we're going to start introducing our right hand to do some other centering techniques. Okay, so first step for us is to just get the clay centered like this. And what that means is that it's not moving. If you close your eyes and put your hand on it, you shouldn't feel any bumps coming from any of the sides. And what this cross section will look like, so it's almost, you know, a short dome. And depending on the shape of your hand, the shape of your actual pot is going to change, like in terms of what your centered lump looks like. Remember, we can use our knife to just scrape away and then go on to another ball. Seal it down. We really don't want any gaps under there. The more water that can get underneath your ball of clay, the more likely you're going to actually have this thing hydroplaning and just coming right off of the wheel head. All right. Vertical palm, straight. Tilted palm. Back down. Okay, and then once we have our clay centered, we're going to do what's called opening. So we're going to put a hole in our clay here. And we're going to do this with our left hand. And we're going to take our thumb and just stretch our thumb straight up. Almost like you're giving the most aggressive thumbs up that you could possibly give. And you're not going to allow your thumb to bend at all. You want it to be really stiff, so nothing's going to bend this. You want a really strong, stiff thumb. Your elbow's still going to be against your body, and your thumb's going to be at about a 45-degree angle, and it's not going to move independently. Your right hand is actually what's going to push down on your thumb, and you're going to find center. How we do that is you could start by going down just a little bit to the left, and it'll create this little knob here, and then as you move towards the right, it'll go away. As soon as that little bit goes away, you're dead on center, and you can just push straight down. And just introduce more water if you need it. So my right hand is doing all the pushing right now. My left hand is just acting as a tool. My right hand is controlling that tool. And you want to keep this whole side of your thumb in contact with the clay here. As you're going down, it'll really help keep things in the middle. You're going to take your needle tool and you're going to get in the hang of measuring the bottom. We're going to be going for 1/4 of an inch for this particular exercise with our cylinders, so 1/4 inch at the bottom. If it's too thick, just go back and push down a little bit more until you get the right thickness. So this the cross section should look more like this. So you can see my thumb is in contact the entire way down. I'm not just going straight down. If you go with the vertical thumb, what's really common is your thumb gets stuck on both sides and you'll just start making a hole that's off center really easily. If you're too far to the left, you'll just have a knob that's fine and you can just pinch it off. If you're too far to the right, your hand's gonna go back and forth. That's gonna be the tendency. But you gotta be really firm with your right hand as you're pushing down. Okay, so it's more of pushing straight down, and I'm being really rigid with this left hand. It's against my body so that it's really supported, and it's not going to try to move independently because the clay is going to try to pull your hand away. You're going to have to fight that the whole way down. All right, to see that one more time, thumb 45-degree angle, really stiff, elbow into your body, right hand pushing down. Water, right hand is pushing down. Be conscious of the thickness at the bottom and make a habit of measuring every single time. So 1/4 of an inch is what we're going for. Okay, so now we're going to do what's called establishing a floor for our cylinders here. So what we're going to do is the same hand position, except your thumb instead of being straight out like that, we're just going to bend it just a little bit. We're going to go all the way down to the bottom here. So I have a bend and it's still really stiff. I don't want my thumb to be able to move back and forth. I'm going to use my right hand and I'm pushing straight to my left. And I'm trying to maintain the same thickness on the floor of this pot. A little bit more water. All right, and then we're going to stop. Our stopping point is going to be as soon as our rim passes our base. So we don't want to go too far, because if you bring it in, when we do bring this in, you can potentially rip this whole ring off. So as soon as your rim is wider than the base, that's your stopping point. Before you're done with this step though, you're going to want to take your thumb and go back and forth from the inside of the wall towards the middle. Right? So what we're doing is compressing, so really light pressure down and towards the middle. This will help us to avoid any S-cracks that can potentially happen in the drying process, in the firing process. We just don't want them to show up, so a good amount of compression. If you have a rib with a flat end like this, you can actually use this straight down, and that'll give you a nice compressed and flat floor, as well as a really nice corner there at the bottom. All right, so this should have a nice flat floor. All right, so we have a nice flat floor, we have a corner, and this is just the foundation of our cylinder. We're just making the floor. That's all we're concerned about right now. So that would be considered our third step. Centering being the first, hole being the second, and then our floor being the third. All right, so again, bend the thumb all the way down to the bottom. Keep the same pressure down, and your right hand is pushing to the left. You're not letting your thumb do anything independently. You're just moving it towards the left. And then our stopping point is when our when our rim is wider than our base. That's our stopping point. Your thumb is really good for compressing back and forth. You can use your fingers, whatever's comfortable, or as before, you can use a rib with a flat end. Okay, so our floor is compressed, it's nice and flat, we have our corner established. What we need to do now is called recentering. So get some water on here, and this is going to be the exact same movement as centering your ball of clay and bringing the clay up. So what we're going to do is a vertical palm here, and all we're going to do is lean in lightly. And what we're going for is an inward taper. All right. So now our taper is going in rather than out, and this is setting us up for bringing the clay up into a nice cylinder. So this would be step 4. Okay, so same as before, we have a flat bottom, we have a nice corner here, our hands are going to be able to get in there, and we're going to bring this wall up. Alright, so recentering again, right? Left hand is vertical, the palm is vertical, very light pressure forward, right? I'm not trying to go fast, I'm not in a hurry. Sometimes your right hand can come over and just make sure that that inside corner is staying where it should be. But we're going for that inward taper. Right? And the shape of your hand is what's dictating the shape of your pot on the outside. Alright, so this step, being efficient at getting to this point, is what I am going to emphasize in class most, because if you can open, well, first if you can center and get centering down pretty quickly, and then the whole establishing a floor, making a nice corner there, good compression, and then bringing it back to this point. If you can get to this point consistently, then making cylinders is going to be a whole lot easier for you. But if you start fumbling around with the first few steps, those are going to be the telltale signs of why your cylinder's maybe not so successful. So really emphasize those first few steps. So if we can get to here consistently, I'm happy for our first few days. And then after that, we're going to really start working on bringing this clay up. So, thinning out the walls. Up until this point, we have been working in the bottom left quadrant. So if we break our wheel down into quadrants here, on the furthest side away from us, in these two quadrants, these are these are spots where you should actually never have your hands. I shouldn't speak in absolutes, but for the most part, we're not going to want to work on this side. We are going to want to work on the side towards us. So we were working in this bottom left, which is a nice spot for centering, this bottom left quadrant. Sometimes you can move around it. And then this bottom right quadrant is mainly where we're going to be working for bringing up our walls. So now, I like to have a sponge in my hand for this part. And what we're going to be doing, the sponge has a little bit of water in it. So if I do need moisture, I can just squeeze it. But ultimately what I do want, so if I'm holding it this way, I do want my fingertips, when I'm pinching the sponge, I want my fingertips to be what's touching the clay. I don't want to rely on the sponge against the clay, just because we're going to develop a bad habit of not actually being able to feel the wall thickness. So if you are going to use a sponge, if it's more comfortable, it does tend to be a little bit more stable in your hands. You can control your fingers a little better if you hold on to a sponge. But you'll hold middle finger to thumb, and then you'll support with your index and your ring finger on the other sides, and you're going to try to make contact with all three at the same time, not at one really small point. So we're going to try to have like a nice broad point of pressure there. And then also my hand is bent a little bit. I don't have flat fingers like this, and I'm not going to be pushing against the side. My hands are tucked because I'm holding something, and that's how I'm pushing into the clay. My inside hand is going to go all the way down to this bottom corner, and it's not going to be pushing out, but it's going to be very rigid, and I'm going to be pushing against it. So how this is going to first look is you want to wet your clay. You only need to wet the surface. You don't need to get water sopping all over the place. So if you can, it's a good idea to have your hands touching. So my thumb will usually piggyback over to my other outside hand, just so these can come up together. You want to be able to move your hands together, like little T-Rex arms almost, is how your hands are coming up. But what we're going to do at the bottom is I'm going to be really stiff with this inside hand, and I'm just going to push in with my outside hand, and then I'm going to release that off. So just so you can see what this looks like from the inside. Is I started pushing in and making this little lump. So on the inside I pushed in here, and now the lump is going above my fingers, right? So that's all we're doing right now, is we're just starting to squeeze at the bottom, and then we're going to start moving this up. And what my hands are going to do, so when I squeeze, my hand isn't drifting in. I'm not letting my left hand drift in, because all that's going to do is just push this wall further and further in. And I'm also not going to push out, because if you push out at all with your inside hand, you're going to start making a bowl. And we're not making bowls right now. We're trying to make nice cylinders. So push into your hand, and then we're going to try to come straight up. Okay. So if we're back here again, remember, sponge is in your hand. If you want the sponge, you don't need the sponge. You can just use your fingertips. So what's going to happen is I'm just going to start pushing in at the bottom here. And I try to give the wheel some time. So if you notice, the wheel went around about 10 times, or I just do sometimes a 5 count in my head, just to make sure that I'm spending enough time at the bottom, because that's where it's thickest and that's where it's hardest to actually gather clay. So I got a nice indent here. My hands, what happened is they squeezed in, and I'm no longer squeezing in anymore. I'm just stuck at that particular thickness, and I'm going to draw that thickness straight up. So hands stay where they are, and then I'm going to come up. If it gets a little sticky, then you can add water. Just release really softly. Get your hands wet, and this is where that sponge comes in handy. And just keep moving up. When you get to the top, don't just rip through the rim. Really slowly approach the top and lighten your squeeze. And we're going to do what's called compressing. We're just going to let our fingers glide, and we can compress down. Just really ensuring that our rim is nice and compressed as we move up. All right, I'll get the water out of here, and you'll get to start seeing what's happening. All right, so from now on, all we're going to be doing is working on thinning out these walls more and more to get to our final cylinder thickness. And that's just going to take everyone a little bit different in terms of amounts of time. I mean, some people, they get this right away, and other people, it takes them, a month, a semester, 2 semesters. Everybody's different. It just depends on how much practice you're doing. But what's happening now is we're just getting really close to our desired thickness. So again, pushing in from the outside. And what I mean about I'm stopping at this thickness, I'm no longer squeezing anymore. So I stop there, and if I draw this thickness up, this is how each pull is made. And you can see this inside hand is just following straight up. It's not pushing out, because you can see just very light pressure can make this move. So the dominant hand is definitely the outside hand. It's almost like an 80-20 thing, 80% pressure from the outside, 20 from the inside, and that just being support pressure. It's not pushing out, it's not moving in space, it's just going straight up. All right, so what this is going to look like now in one smooth motion, pressure, all right, give ourselves this imaginary 5 count. Starts to develop this ring above our hands here, and then we're just going to move up nice and slow. You should be able to just use your throwing rings as a guide, and what that means. So again, when you get to the rim, slow down, ease off your pressure, really lightly remove your hands, and you can compress this rim. We don't want to be pinching our rims too thin at this time, right? We want them to be nice and even. So if you look at my throwing rings here, if you can see them, hopefully you can see them, but they should be really tight. Think of how slow a needle moves on a record player. They should be really tight. You want them overlapping every time that they come up, at least for right now, right? In our early stages of learning this. You want to keep your throwing rings really tight. You do not want them, although it looks really cool, you don't want them to be separated and have these really big gaps. All those gaps are weak spots and could potentially give you issues, and they can also be little gutters for your fingers to get stuck in and get pulled around. Alright, so Between each pull, it's a good idea to wet down the inside and the outside of your wall and get your hands nice and wet. So again, same thing's gonna happen here. I'm gonna squeeze in. Inside hand is still being pretty firm, but I've established my little ring, and then I'm gonna start bringing that thickness up. If I just pause this here, or I'll let it spin so it's not. So you can actually see what this lump looks like from the inside. All right, so my hands are coming up together at the same thickness. And this inside hand, since the floor of the pot is higher than the floor of the wheel head, your inside hand ends up being just slightly higher than your outside hand. So just let that stay the whole time. And what happens is you have this little S going between your fingers. And that's what that is right there. So it's the same shape. And you can see if my hands can touch, I always make sure that my hands are touching. If it's too deep and I can't get my thumb over, then I just do the bottom portion that way. But as soon as I can get my thumb out, I get it out so that they can be touching. Okay, again, we're going to squeeze at the bottom, give it that mental 5 count, and then bring your hands up. No longer squeezing, but at the same thickness. If you continue to squeeze the entire way up, what happens is you'll end up ripping your pot in half, basically. So if this is happening to you, where right about halfway, this whole top ring is popping off in your hand, that just means that you're continuing to squeeze the entire way up, or you're paused in the same spot for too long. So what you want to do is make sure your hands are always moving at a nice consistent pace and that you're not squeezing super hard. This is a really small piece of clay that's in between your fingers, so you shouldn't have to squeeze very hard. Again, at the bottom, a nice squeeze. This is really gentle. Let that ring develop, and then your hands move up. So a really common symptom early on is we're going to start flaring out when we don't want to. All right, so this can be something that starts to look pretty, and when we get to making things that we're keeping, this is a good technique for making shapes. But for right now, we're going to combat against this, and we're going to do what's called collaring in. So you want to get your hands really wet for this, and I put both my elbows into my body, my thumbs are together and pointing up. I'll wet the surface of the clay to make sure that there's nothing sticky. But all I'm going to do is just lightly push in. My fingers are going to constrict around, and all I'm going to do is just lightly constrict my fingers and move straight up. And I can get my rim back towards the middle. If you have to do this between every single pull, that's totally fine. It's better to do it and start every pull with a nice taper towards the middle rather than outside, because it's going to always get wider, and as it gets thinner and wider, it gets harder and harder to bring back in. So if you can always keep an eye on it and bring it back in, it's going to help you out a lot in terms of making your cylinders. And again, compressing, you're just letting this finger glide, and you're pushing down with your index finger. Just really light pressure. Again, I'm going to do one more pull. Make the little ring. I have to push a lot softer now since it's getting to about finished thickness. Get towards the top, and I'm just going to really lightly back off my pressure. Continue all the way up and just pause at the top with my inside hand is doing nothing at this point. It's just guiding at the top, and then I can compress again. This takes everybody a different amount of pulls to get up this way. So not that we should all aim to do it in 3 pulls, but we should definitely not spend a half hour per cylinder, because you're just going to introduce way too much water. The clay is going to get really weak on you, and it's going to be really difficult to work with. So try to do this as fast as possible. So, I wouldn't say as fast as possible, but in the least amount of moves as possible. So anywhere from when we're first learning, try 5 pulls up to 7 pulls, maybe even 10 pulls, and just see what the clay is feeling like. If it's feeling really gooey, chop this off and just move on to the next one, because it can cause more issues than anything else. So before we're finished with these, what we're gonna try is to get rid of this little extra here. Right? This is really common when we're learning. We end up with this little bit of extra clay at the bottom. So what we're gonna do is just use our potter's knife. We hold it like a pencil, like you're gonna be writing, and you want this blade side towards your pot. Okay? So the blade follows the profile of your pot, and if we did a good job of keeping the inside nice and flat and straight with the nice corner there, then we know we can cut straight down without having any issues. So I like to bring it up about an inch or so from the bottom and just let it glide against the surface. My other hand is supporting. Any way you want to support it, 2 hands is better than 1, so I'll sometimes support this way so I have something to push against. But 2 hands, and I'm going to wait for the tip of my tool to start making a cut. And as it does, I'm going to just go really slow all the way down to the wheel head. You want to do this really slow, especially when we're learning. You'll get comfortable with it and be able to do it a little quicker in the future, but for right now, notice how slow and how long that took me. So all the way down to the wheel head. Now we have this little channel in here. An easy way to not have this stick back up into your pot is you just make a little slide with your tool here. So the tip of the tool is right there in the corner, and I'm just going to spin the wheel and pour some water down into that gap. And what this water is going to do is create a slippery surface between these 2 pieces of clay. So right now I'm going to cut underneath with my needle. That piece of clay will release, and all you have to do is stop the wheel and cut it, and it should come off really easy. But this water is a good idea. It's really helpful when we're first learning how to do that. Okay, so this can be our finished cylinder. One of our exercises is going to be to try to make it as flat and straight as possible. I don't have my other rib on me right now, but you can take that standard metal rib that we have in class that you get in your classic Kemper toolkit, and you can chop one end of it to have a 90-degree edge. It's really nice to have an edge that can go down to the wheel head and have a flat side if you're making cylinders. So I'll just use this one that's bought. This is a Mud Tools one. And all I'm going to do is start at the bottom. My inside hand is really lightly going to compress against the rib, and I'm just really light pressure straight up. Alright, so I know that the middle of this pot had a little bit of a waste, so I'm bringing that out. The rim is flaring a little bit, so that'll go in. And that gives you a nice flat corner there, or flat edge. In terms of our rim, the webbing of your fingers is a really nice way to smooth out your rim. Makes it like a nice drinkable rim. But the main thing that we're going to have to worry about is not all of us are going to throw a cylinder that is nice like this on the top. So what you'll end up doing is having to cut some of this off. So say if you have a wonky rim for whichever reason, what you'll end up doing is taking your needle tool, again, hold it like a pencil, and your inside hand, which your left hand, is going to just glide on the inside surface, and you're going to start by drawing a line. I'm not pushing in yet. I'm just letting the tool drag and just start a line. And all I'm gonna do is just slowly increase the pressure until I feel this needle touch my finger. And once it does, I'm gonna just lift up nice and slowly. All right, so that's another skill that we're gonna have to learn. It's just being able to get our rim parallel to the wheel head. I'm gonna round off my rim. So before we ever consider taking off and saving any pots, and this goes for my classes specifically, is we want for our cylinder assignment, right? This is an assignment for school. So for our assignment, we want a perpendicular rim from the wheel head. So make sure that you chop it and that it's nice and flat. We want a straight side. And then before we remove it, we want a little bit of a bevel to help our wire go underneath. So you can see this bevel allows my wire to get under there nicely. All right. So our goal cylinder, right, should be an even bottom and even wall thickness, all the same thickness, right? There shouldn't be any thin spots. What's going to be really common though is we're going to have a little bit more clay down here at the bottom, which is fine, and then a really thin rim, which is also fine. But what our goal is going to be is to get this as straight as possible and an even as possible. Okay, so to review this whole process, you see it go from start to finish, right? Vertical palm, clay goes up. Tilted palm, clay goes down. Remember, we're not pushing down. We shouldn't have to push down and force the clay. You shouldn't be flexing any muscles. You shouldn't be holding your breath. You should be breathing calmly, and you should be making smooth movements. You shouldn't have to muscle 1.5 pounds of clay. So this whole demo was done with 1.5 pounds of clay. So you shouldn't need to be muscling anything around. So just get in the habit, right, of centering, making the clay go up, making the clay go down. All we're doing is showing control here. That's the only purpose of this exercise for making the clay go up and down. It is doing a little bit of wedging to the clay while it's on the wheel, although it's very minimal. But what we're doing is learning how to control our left hand for centering. And then when we work up to bigger pieces of clay, we're going to start introducing our right hand. But for small pieces of clay like this, you should only need one hand. All right, so we center down into our little dome. Stiff thumb at a 45-degree angle gets pushed. Right hand is pushing. Go down to what we think is going to be. So this one, that would be too thick, right? That's like 1/2 inch. We're going for 1/4 inch. So down a little bit more. You're going to start training your eye to be able to look down here and at the wheel head at the same time and use your depth perception to estimate the thickness. So that's a little better. One thing too is you only touch the clay when it's spinning on the wheel. You don't want to put your hands on it and then start spinning, and you don't want to stop the wheel and then remove your hands. All right, so clay is always spinning, and then you put your hands down. Bend that thumb a little bit. Push straight to the left. Get some more water in there. And then our stopping point, again, our rim is wider than our base. That also opens up enough space for us to be able to get our hands in here and compress the floor. and the optional rib if you want a really mechanically flat floor. Recentering, just like centering before, vertical palm and an inward taper. Hands are working together at the bottom right here, and right hand is pushing into the left hand. The inside hand is being really firm. I'm waiting for this little donut to happen, and then my hands are going to come up together nice and slowly. Always remembering to watch our throwing lines and make sure that they're nice and even and they're overlapping. Compress our rim. Early on, when you're making cylinders and you're making this inward taper, this little volcano shape, what's going to happen, it's going to feel like you're pushing away from yourself, and that's totally fine. But try to get in the habit of pushing towards the middle and not pulling out towards your face. So again, some pressure, wait for that indent to happen, inside hand is being really rigid, and then we go up together. Get to the rim and ease off from the inside hand and just follow through with the outside hand, and you can compress. Get used to some water, some compression at the bottom here. See, my thumb can't reach, so it's just waiting. As my hands start going up and the clay gets smaller in my hands, I could reach over and support it. And just up nice and smooth. So I might do one more very light pull to this. Remember, accidents happen, or we can really easily start widening things out. Really wet hands, thumbs together, very light pressure, and just constrict in. Okay. Potter's knife, blade against the pot, following the profile, really slowly, go straight down. Lift straight up. Make your little ramp here. Squeeze some water into that gap. Cut underneath with your needle. Remove this little extra. Okay. Take our rib. Light pressure against the wall. And we're gonna just bring this straight up. Compress our wall. Get in the habit of removing all the water out of the bottom. Just wring out a sponge and let it rest at the floor, and then just pull up. You can squeeze out the moisture. Just do it until there's no pools of water down there. I got a little bit of a funky rim, so I can chop it and make sure that it's perpendicular. Right? As soon as you feel it touch your finger, lift up. And then you can just use your fingers to lightly round off any sharp corners. that's our finished cylinder. Okay, so we're going to do this whole thing from the top now. This will just give you a better understanding of what it looks like from your point of view as you're working on the wheel. All right, so all the steps are going to be repeated through this little quick demo. Remember to seal. And then always use plenty of water. So I just dip my hands completely in the water when I'm doing this. So you should be able to see as I'm pushing the clay up. So vertical palm, the clay will start to rise. Tilted palm, the clay will begin to go down. And you can actually see how much I'm actually pushing this. So pay attention to the diameter of the piece of clay here, and then you'll see how far I'm pushing forward to make the clay go up, and then how it returns back to the wider diameter as it goes down. And keep in mind, my right hand is always supporting either my wrist or I'm using my fingers to make sure that the bottom of where the clay meets the wheel isn't spreading out too far, so it'll bounce back and forth there. Remember, your right hand is pushing down on your left thumb. Your thumb is not articulating in any way. It's just being controlled by your right hand. And you'll see I make a little knob. This is what I mean about being off to the left. You'll create that little knob, and as you move towards the middle, it should just pinch right off, and that lets you know you're right in the middle. If you're too far to the right, you'll see that my thumb will bounce back and forth because it's too far to the right, and it's also going to the left, so you're getting a little bit of bounce, and it's a little harder to control if you're touching both sides of the clay. Try to make a habit of checking your thickness. It's really important early on to just understand how far you're going down, and the more you measure, the more you'll start to understand what it feels like when your clay is at the appropriate thickness. And again, when I'm going to the left there, I'm letting my right hand control my thumb. My left thumb isn't doing anything independently. And same thing here when I'm compressing towards the center. My right hand's controlling my left thumb. If you start to try to move your left thumb, it's really common for you to either start pushing too hard down or your thumb starts to drift. So we're trying to make sure that we don't create any of those bad habits. So a nice smooth floor is what we're going for here. Okay, and then Reese Entering, this is setting us up for our pools. All right, so I've discussed this a little bit before, but if we break the wheel into 4 quadrants with 2 lower and 2 upper, the 2 lower quadrants are actually where we want our hands to be doing most of the work while we're at the wheel. So the bottom left, that's typically where your hands are when you're centering the ball of clay, and then on the right side at the bottom is generally where your hands are when you're beginning to lift the walls up. It's going to be very rare that your hands are on those 2 upper quadrants. So for now, let's just try not to create any bad habits and let your hands drift to that side of the wheel. You have more control directly in front of you. As I'm getting ready to pinch the walls and start thinning out this cylinder, notice how much my hands are sticking together if they can. So you'll see my left thumb kind of reaches up and over the wall and comes down and meets my thumb on the other side. When your hands are together, it's really easy to have them both come up at the same rate. When you separate your hands, it makes that process a lot more difficult. So try to ensure that your hands are touching if they can, if they're within reach. getting your hand into a cylinder is pretty awkward early on. So just try to avoid flaring out the rim too much early on. And always remember, as your wall starts getting thinner and thinner, you're going to want to slow down your wheel speed just to be in a little bit more control. If you go too fast at this point, it's going to flare out almost uncontrollably and automatically. And it makes bringing that wall in a lot more difficult. So here I'm just flaring it out just a little bit just to show you what collaring in looks like from above. So you can see my thumbs are together, really wet hands. My fingers are just slowly constricting, and I'm moving both my hands up at the same time, nice and slow, and you can control that rim and bring it back to the middle pretty quickly. If you have to do that between every pull, that's totally fine, as long as you're in control of that rim. Okay, so back to our potter's knife. We're going to be cutting that little bit of extra that's left at the bottom. So hold it similar to the pencil. Try to use both hands to support so the tool's not doing anything and getting pulled in any direction. You can have a lot more control with both hands. Blade side towards the pot. Follow the profile of your cylinder straight down to the wheel head, nice and slow. Remember, make that little slide with your tool and drop some water in that gap, and that'll just prevent that little bit of extra from sticking to the side of your cylinder. And the needle tool, just make sure you drag it against the wheel head all the way around, and it should release that piece of clay rather easily. For right now, I want us to practice smoothing out the wall on the outside of the cylinder. This will offer some compression, it'll remove some of the slip, and it'll also give you a blank cylinder that you're then going to add texture to, add slip work to, so on and so forth. Kind of like prepping a canvas. If the throwing lines are something that you really do like and you want to investigate with different types of glaze and how that looks, that's totally fine too. But the skill is worth knowing. Cutting the rim is something that we'll have to get pretty comfortable with early on, because we want our rims to be parallel to the wheel head so that we have a nice squared cylinder. You'll always want to round those edges off when you're done. If you notice, my hands were together using that needle tool, and I'm just waiting really slowly for the needle to come in contact with my finger, and as it does, I just lift up nice and softly, and you'll get that ring of clay in your hand. Try to avoid just jamming your needle tool into the side of the wall. You can do more damage than good if you're not careful. Before you remove your cylinders from the wheel head, just make sure you get all that water out from the bottom. If we leave too much water down there, it could really weaken the floor of your pot, and you can end up with an S crack, even if you do compress really well. It'll really affect how the pot dries. So I'm just lightly compressing against that rib on the outside. I'm not pressing really hard with that rib either, just a light compression and ensuring that my walls are nice and vertical. Well, I hope this helped you guys with your cylinders. Leave a comment and let me know if there's anything else that I can clarify to help you make your cylinders better.